put them nowhere near the emperor or power. But the office of Praetorian Prefect was maintained, for I guess sentimental reasons, and Diocletian placed the prefect squarely at the top of his new bureaucracy. In effect, the prefect became a vice-emperor, and it was his job to make sure that the vast new bureaucracy, including the hundreds of staffers that he personally employed, ran as smoothly as it could. But even more than that, his job was to share in the emperor's workload. For most agenda items, the signature of the prefect was just as good as the signature of the emperor, which meant that twice as much could now be done in the same amount of time. In the later part of his reign, Diocletian even went so far as to issue an edict stating that judicial decisions issued by the prefect were no longer appealable to the emperor. You could appeal to the emperor, or you could appeal to the prefect, but you couldn't do both. The prefect was, in short, a really, really powerful guy, and not at all someone you wanted to mess with. So those are the basics of the bureaucracy. Imperial agents out in the field were answerable to the officials who ran the regional offices, who were answerable to their superiors in the cabinet ministries, who were answerable to the department heads, who were answerable to the Praetorian Prefect, who was answerable to the emperor. Throw in the parallel and sometimes intertwined tracks that introduce provincial governors and vicars of the diocese, and what you get is a hugely expanded, centrally run civil service that now governed the whole empire with its own code of ethics, standards, and loyalties. The famously ritualized and labyrinth administrations that came to define the Byzantine Empire, and indeed gave rise to the adjective Byzantine to describe something so multi-layered, overly complicated, and self-perpetuating that it confounds the mind, found its first form back here in the years of the Tetrarchy, as Diocletian sought to bring back adequate governance to the empire. The one thing we haven't really talked about, though, is perhaps Diocletian's most famous reform of all: the nature of the imperial office itself. Discussing Diocletian's desire to rest his legitimacy on divine authority, rather than the approval of the legions or the consent of the Senate. But I didn't really talk about how it worked in practice. How Diocletian, on a daily basis, transformed the Principate into the Dominate. At its most basic level, the transformation took place on a physical level. And it was from these physical changes that Diocletian expected the psychology of his subjects to shift. First and foremost, access to the emperor was severely restricted. He was kept secluded behind doors and officials and guards, and more doors and more officials and more guards, and then long hallways and more doors, until by the time you actually got to the emperor, it was like you were setting foot in some holy inner sanctum. The Principate had been predicated on a calculated intimacy, with emperors going out of their way to show that they were just one of the guys, whether inviting senators over for dinner or sharing in the hardships of the soldiers. Now it was the exact opposite, with calculated aloofness, creating the impression that the emperor was a near mythical figure. Gibbon remarked that Augustus's model sought to conceal the real power of the emperors, while Diocletian's sought to display it. And by keeping the emperor hidden from view, the people's imaginations, with regards to the extent of his almost supernatural powers, began to run freely. Beyond this, there were dozens of subtle shifts. When the consistory met, all the ministers stood while the emperor remained seated. You'll recall that Julius Caesar's fate was practically sealed when he failed to rise to meet a delegation from the Senate, so this was actually a pretty big deal. Upon meeting with the emperor, it was expected that you kiss his robe as a sign of submission, something that would have been absolutely offensive to the Romans of old. But even more offensive might have been the reappearance of that universal symbol of royal authority, the diadem, which he took to wearing along with rich and bejeweled royal robes. The point of all this, as I mentioned before, was not so that Diocletian could indulge his vanity or his megalomania, but so that he could impress upon his subjects that the emperor was indeed above and beyond them. He literally shimmered in the light, never rising from his throne as supplicants cautiously approached to kiss his robes. The empire needed a strong authority figure to reassert order over an empire that had nearly come crashing down, and Diocletian aimed to give it to them in spades. The emperor was no longer princeps, the first citizen. He was dominus, the lord of the empire, and there would be no going back. Taken together, Diocletian's reordering of the governmental apparatus ushered in a whole new era for the Roman Empire, and did nothing less than set the stage for the Byzantine Empire that would carry on Rome's legacy into the Middle Ages. All pretense of public government had now been cast aside. All claims of regional autonomy had now been cast aside. And any hint that the emperor might not be some sort of demigod ruling from a divine palace in the sky had definitely been cast aside. Perhaps most importantly, by abandoning Rome as the capital and reorganizing Italy as just another province, the Roman Empire was finally cut adrift from its Roman heritage, which is, incidentally, how the East was able to keep right on going even after Rome itself had fallen into barbarism. The empire was now, more than ever, a single unit commanded from the center and functioning for the betterment of the whole without regard to tradition, feelings, or even private interest. No more was it first citizen and fellow citizens. It was now ruler and ruled. Plain, simple, and laid bare for all to see. Next week, we will see how much this new dynamic of ruler and rule came to alter the daily lives of the citizens, as Diocletian will seek to control not just the apparatus that governed them, but the economy that they swam in. And it was here that he finally met his match, because if there was one field Diocletian failed to master, it was economics. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I see that there is another Julius Caesar biography available, this one by Samuel Willard Crompton. So if you still can't get enough of everyone's favorite dictator, well, now's your chance to get even more. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who's saying it. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 127, Commanding the Economy. When Diocletian first came into office, the Roman economy was pretty much just limping along. In the critical agricultural sector, the combination of war, plague, and forced migration had left Rome from fewer functional farms. In the less critical but still important urban centers, the hardships of the past 50 years had essentially brought construction, trade, skilled craft, and banking to a standstill. But as with everything else, Diocletian was optimistic about the future. He had big fancy plans for the economy, and turning it into what he wanted to turn everything into, a rational, centrally controlled mechanism that, once organized properly, would begin producing wealth for everyone in quantities not seen in years. Yes, the problem of inflation would put a kink in his plans, but Diocletian was determined to see the Roman economy reinvented, and by the time he abdicated, economic activity in the empire had taken on an almost wholly different character from what it had been before. Part of the change was the result of the natural evolutionary forces of civilization, but much of it was the result of the reforms Diocletian himself initiated. Just to give you an idea of where we're going, I want to talk today about 4 things: the attempt to stabilize the currency, the reorganization of the tax structure, the calcification of professions, and finally, the edict on prices, which, though it achieved basically nothing, is a fascinating bit of history nonetheless. So, yeah, it has finally happened. Years of misguided imperial fiscal policy have finally ruined the currency of the Roman Empire. By the 280s AD, prices had begun to soar, wages had become inadequate, and savings were wiped out. It was bound to happen. As I mentioned before, the sheer volume of base metal coins flooding out into circulation would eventually cause major problems for the empire, and it was during the reign of Diocletian that those chickens finally came home to roost. Which was a particularly maddening state of affairs for the senior Augustus, because in almost every other respect, the empire was recovering from its brush with death. But when it came to the money, not only was the wound not healing, it had only just begun to bleed, and no one knew how to stop it. As with his predecessors, Diocletian understood that there was something inherently dangerous about making the coins of the empire literally less valuable. Of course, that hadn't stopped his predecessors from going ahead and debasing the coins anyway, but they all sort of grasped that they were playing with fire, which is why debasement went on in secret. Aurelian had finally arrested the free fall and even turned back the tide a bit, and Diocletian hoped to follow his lead and bring the currency of the Roman Empire back into respectability. To this end, he ordered that a new hierarchy of 5 coins begin circulation immediately, based on the old 3-metal system. 2 copper coins and 1 silver-copper mixed coin for everyday transactions. 1 nearly pure silver coin, something which had not been seen in years, for larger purposes, and 1 high-grade gold coin reserved for major payments, those usually coming from or going to the imperial government. One of the side effects of debasement had been that cheap silver coins had pushed the more common copper coins, the dollars and cents used on a daily basis by the population, out of circulation, which threw the whole system completely out of whack. Diocletian hoped that his new hierarchy would return balance to the system, but unfortunately, no dice. See, while there is no denying that the coins Diocletian issued during this period were of far better quality than what had been released over the course of the preceding generation, Diocletian was not practicing monetary policy in a vacuum. Had his new currency system been set up on a blank slate, it probably would have worked great. But the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century was anything but a blank slate. There were just millions and millions of bad coins already out there, and given the shortage of precious metals and the exacting standards Diocletian was trying to reassert in the mints, his new coins were simply unable to make a big enough impact to really curb inflation. Plus, the Romans didn't really understand the root of the problem.